The Ritual of Doom. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense. Dark flames flickered atop massive stone pillars, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the gathered crowd. The Zypherans, a tall, reptilian species with gleaming silver eyes, stood in silent anticipation. Their high priest, draped in golden robes, raised his clawed hands toward the night sky. Tonight was the Ritual of Doom, the most sacred event in Zypheran history. And tonight, the gods would feast on the life of a human. At the center of the great altar, Drake Carter stood with his hands bound behind his back. His shirt was torn, blood smeared across his face, but his eyes burned with something the Zypherans could not understand. Defiance. The high priest's voice echoed through the temple. This human is unworthy. His kind is weak, but his blood shall satisfy the gods. Let the ritual begin. The crowd erupted into a chorus of hissing and roars. Drake did not flinch. A Zypheran warrior stepped forward, holding a long ceremonial dagger with a curved obsidian blade. The edge shimmered under the blue moonlight. Slowly, he raised it above Drake's heart. The silence was deafening. Drake's muscles tensed. His mind raced. He had been in tight situations before. Ambushes, traps, last stands. But this was different. There was no cover, no weapons, no easy way out. Yet he smirked. The high priest noticed it. His silver eyes narrowed. Why do you smile, human? You are moments away from death. Drake tilted his head slightly. I was just thinking. You all look so proud of yourselves. You really believe you're in control, don't you? The Zypherans hissed angrily, but the high priest ignored them. He took a step closer. You do not fear the gods. Drake let out a short laugh. Oh, I fear something, all right. He turned his gaze toward the sky. But not your gods. A sudden boom split the air. The ground trembled. The stone altar cracked beneath Drake's feet. Screams of panic echoed through the temple as a fiery explosion lit up the horizon. The high priest stumbled back. What is this? Another explosion. Then another. The Zypherans turned their heads toward the city beyond the temple walls. Bright streaks of light rained down from the sky. Plasma fire. Drake's smile widened. Right on time. The rescue team had arrived. In the confusion, Drake twisted his wrists, snapping the rope that bound him. The Zypherans were too distracted to notice, until he moved. With a sudden burst of energy, Drake lunged forward. His knee slammed into the stomach of the warrior holding the dagger. The alien gasped, doubling over. Before he could recover, Drake grabbed the dagger and drove it into the warrior's arm. The creature screeched in pain. Shouts erupted from the crowd. The guards moved toward him, weapons raised. But they were too late. A massive ship roared overhead, its engines shaking the temple walls. The bright light of its thrusters blinded the Zypherans as it hovered just above the altar. Drake didn't hesitate. He ran. A series of plasma bolts rained down, striking the guards nearest to him. They fell with agonized cries. Carter, move your ass, a voice crackled through the air. Drake looked up and grinned. A familiar figure stood at the open ramp of the ship. Commander Lin, his old squad mate. Without slowing down, Drake leaped off the altar, just as Lin extended a mechanical arm toward him. Their hands locked, and Lin yanked him up. The Zypherans roared in fury. The high priest raised his arms toward the sky. The gods will strike you down. This is blasphemy. Drake, now safe inside the ship, smirked down at him. He gave the high priest a two-finger salute. Your gods can try. With a final roar, the ship's engines flared, and it shot into the sky. Behind them, the temple burned. But the battle had only just begun. The rebellion awakens. The ship trembled as it broke through the thick clouds of Sirroth's atmosphere. The smell of burnt ozone and scorched metal filled the air inside the cabin. Drake Carter wiped the blood off his face with the back of his hand, his pulse still hammering from the chaos of the escape. Across from him, Commander Lin sat in the pilot's chair, his cybernetic fingers dancing over the controls. The cockpit glowed with blue holodisplays, updating their altitude, shield integrity, and enemy pursuit. Drake exhaled sharply. That was cutting it close. Lynn smirked without looking away from the controls. You should have seen the first plan. We were supposed to grab you before they dragged you to the altar, but someone decided to put on a show instead. Drake leaned back against the cold metal of the ship's hull. Gotta keep the audience entertained. Lynn shook his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. But before he could respond, a warning alarm blared through the ship. Multiple hostiles inbound, the ship's AI announced. Drake turned to the viewport. A squadron of Sci-Fi interceptors was cutting through the dark sky, their sleek, black frames almost invisible against the void. Plasma cannons hummed, charging up for a strike. Lynn cursed under his breath. Hang on. The ship veered sharply to the left as the first plasma blast sizzled past them. The force slammed Drake against the side of the cabin. He gritted his teeth and reached for the nearest safety strap. Lynn's voice was calm, focused, weapons online. About damn time, Drake muttered. The ship's twin cannons rotated into position beneath the hull. A targeting reticle flickered to life on the main screen. Drake's fingers curled into a fist. He knew they were outnumbered. Sci-Fi pilots were ruthless, their ships faster and deadlier in the air. But humans had a nasty habit of surviving. Lynn's voice crackled through the comms. Hold tight. Then he hit the thrusters. The ship surged forward, weaving through enemy fire with impossible speed. Lynn spun the vessel in a controlled roll, dodging plasma bolts with a precision that only came from years of combat. Drake grinned. You've been practicing. Lynn didn't reply. Instead, he pulled the trigger. Twin bursts of red-hot plasma erupted from their ship's cannons. One of the Sci-Fi interceptors took a direct hit to its left wing. The explosion was brief but violent, sending burning debris spiraling through the sky. The remaining interceptors closed in fast. Drake's grip tightened. If they got hit, it was over. But just as another round of enemy fire screamed toward them, a new signal appeared on the radar. Unknown contacts approaching, the AI reported. Drake frowned. More Sci-Fi. Lynn's eyes flicked to the scanner. Then, for the first time that night, his expression shifted from determination to surprise. No, he murmured. Not Sci-Fi. From the darkness, 3 massive ships broke through the clouds. Their hulls were rusted, patched together with different alien metals. The symbols on their sides were unfamiliar, but Drake recognized the design. Pirates. The Sci-Fi interceptors hesitated for a brief moment, just long enough for the newcomers to open fire. Bright yellow plasma streaked across the sky, ripping through the Sci-Fi ships like paper. One by one, the sleek black vessels exploded, forced into retreat. Lynn let out a low whistle. Well, that's unexpected. Drake narrowed his eyes. I hate dealing with pirates. As if on cue, the comms crackled with static. A deep, gravelly voice broke through. Human vessel. It said, this is Captain Rask of the Iron Fang clan. You owe us. Land now, or we shoot you down next. Drake sighed. Yep, just another day in paradise. The rebellion begins. The landing bay was dimly lit, filled with the smell of oil, sweat, and old metal. The Iron Fang clan wasn't known for hospitality, but for now, they weren't trying to kill Drake and Lynn, so that was a win. Captain Rask stood at the center of the bay, flanked by a group of rough-looking aliens from different species. His face was covered in scars, and his cybernetic arm whirred as he crossed his arms. You're lucky we were in the area, Rask said. His deep red eyes flicked to Drake. Sci-Fi don't usually let their sacrifices escape. Drake smirked. Well, I'm not a usual sacrifice. Rask let out a low chuckle. I like you, human. That's why I'm offering you a deal. Lynn raised an eyebrow. We're not looking for work. Rask ignored him. He stepped closer to Drake. The Zypherans control most of this sector. Their temples, their rituals, they're just a way to keep their rule strong. They don't sacrifice people because of their gods. They do it because it keeps everyone afraid. Drake didn't respond. Rask leaned in slightly. I've seen it before, Carter. Fear is their weapon. But you just made a whole crowd of Zypherans question their faith. Do you know what that means? Drake did. If the Zypherans' power rely on control, then disrupting their rituals could start a rebellion. Lynn crossed his arms. Let me guess. You want us to help you take them down. Rask grinned, showing sharp metal teeth. Not just me. There are others. People who want to fight back. They just need someone to show them how. Silence filled the air. Drake ran a hand through his short, sweat-dampened hair. He had escaped death tonight. He could walk away, disappear into deep space, and never deal with the Zypherans again. But that wasn't who he was. He looked up at Rask. How do we start? Rask's grin widened. By doing what you do best, human. Drake smirked. Causing trouble. Exactly. The gods are watching. The cold wind howled through the abandoned ruins of an old outpost on Xeroth's dark side, far from the Zypheran temples and their cities. It had once been a battlefield. Rusted weapons and skeletal remains of forgotten warriors lay scattered beneath the dusty moons. Drake Carter stood at the edge of a cracked command console, staring at the flickering holographic map before him. The Zypherans had ruled for centuries, their empire built on the fear of their so-called gods. But now, after centuries of control, cracks were forming. He was going to shatter those cracks wide open. Behind him, Commander Lynn, Captain Rask, and a handful of rebels stood in silence, waiting for Drake to speak. These were the ones who believed in change, the ones who dared to hope. Drake exhaled and turned to face them. The Zypherans are scared, he said, his voice cutting through the wind. They saw a human walk away from their most sacred sacrifice. They saw their gods do nothing. They won't admit it, but I know it's eating at them. Rask, arms crossed, nodded. Good. But what's next? We can't fight them head-on. They have fleets, armies, and every planet in this sector under their control. Drake smirked. We don't need to fight them head-on. We just need to prove their gods are a lie. Lynn frowned. And how do you plan to do that? Drake stepped forward, tapping the holographic map. A massive structure appeared, a towering spire deep within the Zypheran capital. The temple core, he said, the heart of their faith. It's where the Zypherans claim their gods speak to them. Every major ritual is connected to it. One of the rebels, a frail but intelligent-looking alien named Mira, spoke up. You think it's some kind of technology? The control system. Drake nodded. Exactly. I don't believe in gods, but I do believe in manipulation. If we expose whatever's inside that temple, the entire foundation of their empire crumbles. The room went silent. The idea was insane. Rask let out a low chuckle. You're suggesting we break into the holiest place in the Zypheran Empire, in the most heavily guarded city, and expose their greatest secret. Drake grinned. Yeah, that's pretty much the plan. Lynn sighed. Of course it is. Inside the heart of the Empire, 2 days later, Drake, Lynn, and a small strike team infiltrated the Zypheran capital under the cover of darkness. The city gleamed with golden spires, its streets lined with statues of towering alien gods. The temple core stood at the center of it all, a monolithic structure, pulsing with an eerie blue glow. Zypheran high guards patrolled its entrance, their armor reflecting the temple's unnatural light. Drake's pulse was steady. He adjusted the small stealth device clipped to his belt, a piece of stolen Zypheran tech that disrupted sensors but wouldn't hold up against a full security scan. Lynn crouched beside him, peering through his visor. 3 guards at the front. More inside. We can't fight our way in. Drake smirked. Good thing we're not walking through the front door. Mira, who had joined them for this mission, tapped on a hacked datapad. "There's an old maintenance shaft at the base of the temple. If we can get past the first layer of security, we'll have a straight shot to whatever's inside." Drake gave her a nod. "Then let's move." The team slipped through the shadows, avoiding patrols and automated turrets. The air was thick with incense and whispers of prayers, as if the very walls were alive with zephyr and faith. Then they found it, a hidden access point near the temple's foundation. Mira quickly disabled the security lock, and the hatch slid open with a low hiss. One by one, they climbed inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The secret of the gods. Deep beneath the temple, the air grew colder. The walls were lined with strange markings, glowing faintly under the dim emergency lights. Drake moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing. He had expected ritual chambers, ancient scrolls, some kind of religious artifacts. But what they found was far worse. At the center of the underground chamber, a massive machine pulsed with unnatural energy. Thick cables ran along the floor, leading to thousands of stasis pods, each containing a different alien species, frozen, locked away, used for something unknown. Lin inhaled sharply. "What the hell is this?" Mira frantically scanned the data. "It's a control system. This entire temple. It's a machine that sends signals across the Sci-Fi Empire. It's not their god speaking. It's this." Drake clenched his fists. The Zypherans had never been speaking to gods. They had been hearing signals from a hidden AI, manipulating their beliefs for centuries. Every prophecy, every ritual, every divine message, a carefully crafted lie. The Zypherans were ruled by a ghost in a machine. And now, Drake was going to destroy it. The betrayal. Before he could react, the doors slammed shut behind them. A cold voice echoed through the chamber. "You should not have come here, human." Drake turned sharply. Standing at the entrance was a familiar figure, the Zypheran high priest. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a traitor. Rask. Drake's jaw tightened. "You sold us out." Rask shrugged. "I told you, Carter. I like you. But I like staying alive more. The Zypherans made me a better offer." Lin reached for his weapon, but before he could fire, the temple's security systems activated. Red alarms flashed. The air grew thick with the hum of charging energy. The stasis pods began to hiss and open. And from within them, something woke up. The first creature stepped forward, its skin pale, its eyes hollow. It was not alive. Not truly. The machine had done something to them. Drake's stomach dropped. The Zypherans hadn't just been sacrificing people. They had been turning them into something else. The high priest smiled. "You wish to meet the gods, human." He gestured to the creatures slowly crawling from their pods. "Now you shall meet them in their truest form." The room filled with inhuman screeches. Drake turned to Lin. "We need to blow this place apart." Lin gritted his teeth, working on it. Rask took a step back, suddenly realizing his mistake. "Wait, what is this?" The high priest's expression darkened. "Sacrifices must be made." The creatures lunged. Drake barely had time to grab his weapon before the battle began. The human problem. The temple walls trembled with the unholy screeches of the creatures emerging from the stasis pods. Their pale, lifeless eyes reflected the red emergency lights flickering above. They were not alive, yet they moved. Drake Carter gritted his teeth, plasma pistol in hand, standing between the high priest, the traitorous Captain Rask, and the horrors waking up around them. The Zypherans had been lying for centuries. Their gods were not divine. Their rituals were not sacred. It was all a system, a machine designed to control minds and reshape the universe in their image. And the worst part, they had been creating monsters in the name of faith. One of the creatures lunged. Drake barely rolled aside before its claws raked the air where his head had been. Lin fired first. A blast of plasma struck the creature in the chest, but instead of collapsing, it twitched and kept coming. "Shit," Lin muttered. They don't die easy. Drake shot the next one in the head. The pale form staggered, let out a gurgling hiss, and dropped, but not for long. Mira frantically worked on her datapad. This whole system, it's keeping them alive. The energy from the machine, it reanimates them even after they're dead. Drake clenched his jaw. They weren't fighting warriors. They were fighting the dead. And the dead didn't stop. Betrayal runs deep. From the other side of the room, Rask took a step back, looking between Drake and the horrors unfolding around them. His breathing was ragged. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't part of the deal, he stammered, his mechanical arm twitching as he gripped his blaster. A high priest of the Xiphorans simply smiled, his silver eyes glowing with eerie light. The gods demand sacrifice, Captain Rask. Did you truly think you would be spared? Rask's expression darkened. He turned his blaster toward the priest. You bastard. Before he could fire, the priest whispered something in an ancient language. The creatures turned to Rask all at once. His face went pale. Oh hell. In a split second, they pounced. Rask screamed as the undead horrors dragged him to the ground. His cybernetic arm sparked as claws tore into his flesh, his blaster falling from his grip. Drake didn't have time to watch. He turned to Lynn. We need to get the hell out of here. Lynn's jaw was tight. Working on it. Mira's voice crackled with urgency. If we overload the machine, it should cut off the energy flow. It won't kill them, but it'll stop them from waking up again. Drake exhaled sharply. Then do it. Now. Mira's fingers moved furiously over her datapad, bypassing the ancient security codes. The machine at the heart of the temple began to pulse erratically, its glow shifting from blue to red. The high priest's smile faded. What are you doing? Drake pointed his blaster at him, something your gods never expected. And then the whole temple shook. The fall of a false god. The system was failing. The energy keeping the creatures alive flickered like a dying flame. Some of them staggered, others collapsed mid-lunge. The high priest let out a furious roar, his once composed face twisting in rage. You think this will change anything, human? He spat. You may break this machine, but you cannot break faith. The Xiphoran people will never stop believing. Drake tilted his head, lowering his weapon slightly. That's so. He smirked. Then I guess they won't mind if we broadcast this to the whole empire. The priest's eyes widened. Mira grinned from where she was crouched by the controls. Already on it. Every Xiphoran temple. Every military base. They're all seeing the truth right now. The priest stumbled back. No. On massive screens across the Xiphoran capital, the truth was unfolding in real time. The false gods, the machine, the monstrosities created in the shadows. It was all being exposed. And with it, the Xiphoran Empire's greatest lie was crumbling. The high priest let out a guttural scream of rage. With wild, desperate eyes, he turned and ran, straight toward the machine's central core. Drake's eyes widened. Oh, hell no. Lynn fired. The shot hit the priest in the shoulder, but he kept running. He reached the core and pressed his palm against an ancient control panel. The temple's emergency alarms blared. Mira's face went pale. Oh no. Drake's stomach twisted. What now? She turned to him. He just activated the failsafe. The machine is going into meltdown. It's going to take the entire city with it. Drake muttered a curse under his breath. Of course he did. Race against time. The temple was falling apart. Chunks of the ceiling collapsed, crushing some of the still-moving undead creatures. The ground split open as energy surged through the ancient structure, glowing cracks spreading across the floor. Lynn pulled Drake back as a massive piece of the temple's roof crashed down, where he had been standing a second ago. Mira was frantically typing. I can shut it down, but I need time. Drake grabbed her arm. We don't have time. We need to get out of here. Lynn's voice was sharp. If that machine detonates, This whole city turns into a crater. Drake looked around at the collapsing structure, then back at the dying high priest, who was laughing even as blood spilled from his mouth. The priest smiled through the pain. If the gods cannot rule, then no one will. Drake's grip tightened on his blaster. He hated this. But there was only one way out. He turned back to Mira. "Can you override the detonation remotely?" She hesitated, then nodded. "If I'm close enough." Drake exhaled sharply. "Then we take the ship. And we bring this bastard with us." Lynn blinked. "Wait, what?" Drake pointed at the dying priest. "If he started it, he knows how to stop it." Lynn stared for a moment, then sighed. "You are way too good at making things complicated." Drake grinned. "That's what humans do best." They grabbed the high priest, forcing him to his feet as the temple crumbled around them. As they sprinted for the exit, Drake turned to Lynn. "Get ready, because the Zypherans are about to have a bigger problem than their gods." Lynn smirked. "Oh, and what's that?" Drake glanced back at the collapsing temple. The truth. The battle for truth. The sky over the Zypheran capital was no longer a picture of divine peace. It was a battlefield. Columns of black smoke rose from the shattered temple, glowing embers swirling in the night air like dying stars. Fires raged in the streets below as panic spread through the city. The truth had been broadcasted to every Zypheran world. Their gods were a lie. Their sacred temple was nothing more than a machine, a system designed to enslave minds, manufacture fear, and reanimate the dead. And now, with the temple's core in full meltdown, the city was on the verge of total destruction. Drake Carter ran through the collapsing ruins, dragging the wounded high priest with him. Lynn and Mira sprinted beside him, blasters drawn, covering their retreat. "We're running out of time." Mira shouted over the distant wailing alarms. Drake tightened his grip on the priest's arm. The alien leader's once golden robes were now tattered and soaked in blood. His face was twisted in pain, but there was still defiance in his silver eyes. "You think you've won, human." The priest spat weakly. "You may have shattered the illusion, but the Zypherans will never follow you. They will tear your kind apart for what you've done." Drake didn't stop running. He didn't even look at him. "I don't need them to follow me," he said. "I just need them to stop following you." Lynn's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Ship's inbound, but we've got a big problem." Drake frowned. "Bigger than a citywide explosion." Lynn cursed under his breath. "Yeah, the Zypheran military is on its way. They're not evacuating people. They're coming to burn the whole city." Drake's stomach clenched. Of course, the Zypheran rulers knew the truth would spread like wildfire. Their empire was built on faith. Without it, their control would collapse overnight. So instead of trying to contain the rebellion, they were going to erase it. Drake turned to Mira. "How long until this place blows?" She looked at her datapad, her eyes widening. 7 minutes. Maybe less. Drake exhaled sharply. "Then we have 7 minutes to get out of here." Lynn's voice came through again. "Correction. 6 minutes. And we've got incoming." Drake turned his gaze to the skies above the capital. Through the thick smoke, he could see dozens of Zypheran warships cutting through the atmosphere. Their sleek black hulls glowed with pulsating red energy as they descended like vultures over a dying world. And they weren't alone. Behind them, the Zypheran Holy Guard, the deadliest warriors in the Empire, were descending from the dropships in tight formations, their energy lances crackling with blue fire. Drake clenched his jaw. They weren't coming to fight a war. They were coming to finish the ritual. The last stand. Drake and his team burst onto the temple's outer platform, just as their ship came roaring through the smoke-filled sky. Lynn was already hanging out of the open cargo bay, firing into the air as Zypheran soldiers landed on the platform in waves. Drake pulled the priest behind cover as blaster fire tore through the ground beside them. Lynn shouted from the ship, "Move." Drake turned to Mira. Can you shut this thing down remotely? She was already working on it, fingers flying across her datapad. I can stall the explosion, but I need a few more minutes. Drake turned back toward the approaching Zypheran guard. Their armor gleamed under the city's burning glow, their weapons raised, their faces devoid of hesitation. They still believed. The priest chuckled weakly behind him. Even now, they march for the gods. Drake didn't look back. He raised his blaster. Then let's show them what their gods really are. The first wave of Zypherans charged. Drake and Lynn opened fire at the same time. The platform erupted into chaos. Lynn's plasma rifle screamed as he dropped two of the Holy Guard before they could reach the ship. Drake took a calculated shot at a charging officer, his blaster bolt hitting the warrior's energy pack, which exploded in a shower of blue sparks. But for every Zypheran they cut down, 3 more took their place. Mira cursed under her breath. Almost there. Hold them off a little longer. Drake dodged a spear thrust, rolling to the side before bringing his blaster up, point blank into his attacker's chest. One shot. The guard crumpled. Lynn's voice crackled over the comms. We can't hold this position forever. Drake gritted his teeth. They had seconds left. Then he felt it. A shift in the air. The priest was moving. Drake turned just in time to see the Zypheran leader pull a concealed energy blade from his robes. His eyes burned with the last remnants of faith. If I die, human, I will die a martyr. Drake's instincts kicked in. The blade came down. Drake sidestepped at the last second, grabbing the priest's wrist and twisting. The energy blade skidded from his grip. Drake caught it mid-air, turned, and drove it straight through the priest's chest. The high priest gasped. His silver eyes flickered with something almost human. Then he collapsed. The battle around them slowed. The Zypheran warriors stopped fighting. They stared at their fallen leader, their so-called messenger of the gods, dying by a human's hand. Drake stood over him, blood dripping from the glowing blade. His voice was steady. There are no gods. The words echoed through the platform, cutting deeper than any weapon ever could. The Zypheran soldiers hesitated, and in that single fragile moment, the faith that held an empire together broke. Mira's voice rang out. I did it. The meltdown is stupid. Drake didn't waste time. He turned to Lynn. Get out of here. Lynn didn't need to be told twice. The ship's thrusters flared, lifting off as Drake and Mira jumped onto the ramp. The last thing they saw before the cargo bay doors sealed shut was the Zypheran warriors dropping their weapons. Some fell to their knees. Others looked up at the burning temple. Confusion and fear etched into their faces. For the first time in centuries, they had no gods to guide them. The beginning of the end. As their ship broke through the atmosphere, Mira collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. Lynn exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I can't believe that worked. Drake leaned against the wall, staring at the burning capital shrinking behind them. It's not over, he murmured. Not yet. Mira frowned. What do you mean? The Zypheran faith is broken. Their empire is falling apart. Drake's gaze darkened. That's the problem, he said. Empires don't die quietly. Lynn's expression shifted. So what now? Drake exhaled. Now. He met their eyes. Now we make sure they never rise again. The last sacrifice. The Zypheran Empire was in freefall. For centuries, they had ruled through fear and faith, using the belief in their divine gods to crush resistance and keep entire planets under control. Now, that belief was shattered. The capital was burning. The high priest, their so-called voice of the gods, was dead by a human's hand. Across the empire, temples fell, rebellions ignited, and soldiers abandoned their posts. But empires don't die quietly. Drake Carter knew this wasn't the end. The Zypherans weren't just going to let go of their power. They were going to fight for it. and they were about to make their last desperate move. The Emperor's counterattack. Inside the bridge of the Phantom's Claw, Drake stood watching the flames of the capital through the viewport. The temple was gone. The city was in chaos. But something was wrong. Lin was at the controls, eyes flicking over scanners that showed movement in orbit. "I don't like this," Lin muttered. "We're picking up Xiphoran warships regrouping outside the system." Drake's brow furrowed. "How many?" Lin tapped the display. "Enough to burn every planet in their own empire to the ground." Drake's stomach tightened. The Xiphorans weren't just trying to recover. They were preparing for a scorched earth retreat. Mira's voice was sharp. "I've intercepted a transmission." She adjusted the holo display, and a grainy projection filled the bridge. An elderly Xiphoran appeared, clad in dark ceremonial robes, his silver eyes burning with something that sent a cold chill through the air. Drake had never seen him before, but he knew exactly who he was. The Xiphoran Emperor. The figure spoke, his voice smooth and unshaken. "The galaxy believes we are finished. They think we will fall like lesser beings, but they do not understand sacrifice." Drake narrowed his eyes. The Emperor continued, "If the gods have abandoned us, then we will become gods ourselves. If our empire cannot rule this galaxy, then no one shall." The message cut out. Mira's face had gone pale. That wasn't a battle speech. Drake exhaled sharply. No, that was a damned suicide note. Lin's jaw tightened. They're going to take everything with them. Drake turned toward the viewport. The Xiphoran fleets were no longer retreating. They were moving toward 3 key planets, major Xiphoran colonies, and at the heart of their formation, a doomsday weapon. Mira's voice was barely a whisper. "They're going to wipe out their own people." Drake clenched his fists. Of course they were. The Xiphorans weren't interested in surrender. They weren't trying to survive. They were trying to erase history. And unless someone stopped them, entire worlds would burn. The impossible mission. Drake turned to his crew. "We have to take out that weapon." Lin let out a dry laugh. "Oh, is that all? Just suicide run a war fleet." Mira studied the schematics of the Xiphoran flagship, her fingers flying across the console. The device is built into the core of the Emperor's ship. It's designed to trigger an energy cascade, a chain reaction that will wipe out every Xiphoran-controlled world. Lin cursed. "So basically, it's a death switch." Mira nodded grimly. "And it's already charging." Drake ran a hand over his face. They had no fleet, no army, just one ship and a handful of rebels. But he had seen empires fall before, and sometimes all it took was one person in the right place at the right time. Drake's voice was steady. "Then we get on that ship." Lin blinked. "We what now?" Drake turned toward him. "We infiltrate the Emperor's flagship. We take out the control core. If we kill the power source, we kill the weapon." Lin let out a breath. "And how exactly do we get onto the most secure warship in the fleet?" Drake smirked. "We knock on the front door." Boarding the Emperor's ship, the Phantom's Claw jumped into the heart of the enemy fleet. Alarms screamed across the Xiphoran warships as plasma cannons opened fire. Lin threw the ship into a wild spin, dodging columns of red-hot plasma that barely missed their hull. Inside the ship, Drake held onto the railings, eyes locked on the massive flagship ahead. Mira's voice crackled over comms. "This ship won't last in a firefight." Drake grabbed his blaster. "Then let's make sure we don't have to fight long." With a violent jolt, Lin slammed the ship into the outer hull of the Emperor's vessel. The landing clamps hissed, sealing them against the armored exterior of the warship. Drake turned to Mira. "Can you override the locks?" She was already at work, slicing through the enemy firewalls. "I just need." "Got it." The airlock doors slid open. Drake turned to his team. "No speeches. No gods. Just one job." Lin grinned. "Blow up the bad guys." Drake smirked. "Blow up the bad guys." They stormed the Emperor's ship. The final battle. The corridors of the flagship were lined with elite Sci-Fi guards, their armor shimmering with golden energy. But Drake had fought gods before. Now, they were just men. The battle was fast and brutal. Blaster fire ripped through the halls. Explosions tore through security stations. Mira hacked into the ship's control systems, shutting down defensive turrets as Lin covered her with precision shots. Drake fought his way forward, each step taking him closer to the core of the doomsday device. And then, at last, they reached it. The reactor chamber was massive, a swirling vortex of energy contained in a fragile lattice of technology. The Emperor stood before it. His robes were gone. His ceremonial armor was black and gold, his silver eyes burning with fanatical purpose. "You do not belong here, human," the Emperor said. Drake raised his blaster. "Neither do your gods." The Emperor charged. Drake barely dodged the first strike, rolling aside as the Sci-Fi ruler swung a crackling energy blade. The fight was brutal. The Emperor was fast, inhumanly fast. But Drake was human, and humans didn't fight with rituals or prophecy. They fought to win. With a final move, Drake caught the Emperor's wrist, twisted the blade, and drove it into his chest. The Sci-Fi leader let out a shuddering breath. Then he fell. Drake turned to Mira. "Shut it down." She hesitated, then hit the final command. The energy reactor collapsed inward, shutting down before it could detonate. The Sci-Fi fleet had lost its greatest weapon. And with it, they lost their war. The end of an empire. As Drake and his team escaped the collapsing flagship, the Sci-Fi fleets broke apart. Without their emperor, without their gods, there was nothing left to fight for. The war was over. Drake stood in the cockpit of the Phantom's Claw, watching the Sci-Fi empire fall. Lin clapped him on the back. "You know, you're getting good at this whole ending civilizations thing." Drake smirked. "Let's hope it's the last one." Mira shook her head. "It never is." Drake exhaled. No gods, no masters, just a new galaxy waiting to be rebuilt. A new order. The Sci-Fi empire was dead. Its gods had been exposed as a lie. Its temples had burned. Its fleets were scattered. Its leaders either dead, captured, or fleeing into the dark corners of space. But the galaxy did not celebrate. It did not breathe a sigh of relief. Because now it faced the unknown. The empire that had once controlled entire star systems with its iron grip had fallen in a single night. And in the vacuum left behind, chaos was rising. Drake Carter stood at the bridge of the Phantom's Claw, staring down at the broken remains of the Sci-Fi capital world. The planet was quiet, but not in peace, in uncertainty. The people below had been ruled by faith for centuries, and now that faith was gone, the question that haunted Drake's mind was simple. What happens next? The power struggle begins. A holographic galactic map flickered before him. It was a mess. Conflicts, uprisings, and power grabs were erupting across every Sci-Fi controlled world. Lin leaned against the console, arms crossed. "You were right. Empires don't die quietly." Drake nodded. He had seen it before. The fall of power always meant new wars, new struggles, new tyrants looking to take the throne. Mira was running calculations on a datapad, her face tense. Some of the former Sci-Fi generals are rallying troops. Not all of them were religious fanatics. A lot of them just don't want to give up their power. Drake exhaled sharply. "And what about the rebels? The ones who fought with us?" Mira hesitated. "Some want democracy. Some want revenge. Others just want to survive. But they all want different things." Lin let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, that's how revolutions work. First you break the empire. Then you break each other." Drake ran a hand over his face. They hadn't won a war. They had opened the floodgates to a new one. Mira brought up another screen. "There's worse news." Lin groaned. "Of course there is." Mira's fingers flicked over the console, zooming in on the galactic map. The Sci-Fi warlords. The ones who fled, they are regrouping. They've abandoned the empire, but they've still got fleets. And now, they're looking to carve out their own territories. Drake clenched his jaw. They'll be worse than the Xipheran government ever was. Lynn nodded. Because they're not trying to rule an empire anymore. They're just trying to survive. And nothing is more dangerous than a cornered animal. Mira looked up at Drake. What do we do? Drake stared at the map. They had been fighting to destroy the empire. Now they had to fight to keep something worse from taking its place. The gathering of leaders. 1 week later, Drake and his crew landed on a neutral world, a desolate, war-torn moon known as HFY. It was here that the leaders of the rebellion, rogue generals, and surviving planetary rulers had gathered. They needed to decide the fate of the galaxy. Drake hated politics. He had spent his entire life fighting wars, not sitting in council chambers. But now he had no choice. As he and Lynn stepped into the makeshift war room, all eyes turned to him. Some saw him as a hero. Some saw him as a problem. Some wanted him dead. A Gordian warlord, a massive brute with armored scales, growled. The Xipheran throne is empty. Someone must take it. A former Xipheran officer, her golden armor tarnished from battle, shook her head. There will be no throne. The Xipheran rule is finished. An independent planetary leader, a weary-looking man with deep-set eyes, scoffed. Then what do you propose? Anarchy. Chaos. 1,000 warlords fighting over scraps. Drake leaned against the table, listening. He wasn't here to rule. He didn't want power. But he knew what would happen if the wrong person took control. Lynn muttered under his breath, "This is going well." Mira whispered, "I count at least 4 people who would stab each other right now." Drake finally spoke. His voice was calm but sharp. "You're all making a mistake." The room fell silent. Drake stepped forward, his presence commanding. The Xipherans ruled with fear. If you try to take their place, you're just building a new empire with a different face. The Gorvian warlord sneered. "Then what do you suggest, human?" Drake stared him down. "We don't need another empire. We need a choice." A former Xipheran commander frowned. "A republic." Drake shrugged. "Call it whatever you want. But the second one of you crowns yourself a ruler, this whole war starts again. And next time, it won't be against the Xipherans. It'll be against each other." Silence filled the war room. Some of them nodded. Some of them didn't like what they heard. Drake didn't care. He wasn't here to make them comfortable. He was here to make sure they didn't destroy everything they had fought for. The rise of something new. It took days of negotiation. Threats. Arguments. Deals made in shadows and backrooms. But in the end, the decision was made. The Xipheran Empire would not be replaced. Instead, a new alliance of free worlds would form, a system where no single power could rise unchecked. Drake stood on the balcony of the war room, watching the new leaders shake hands, sign agreements, and seal the fate of the galaxy. Lynn leaned beside him. "So, what now?" Drake smirked. "Now." He looked up at the stars. "We let them figure it out." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "And us?" Drake chuckled. "Us? We go find another fight." Mira crossed her arms. "You do know there will always be another war, right?" Drake nodded. "Yeah." He exhaled. "But at least this one's over." He turned, walking away from the balcony. Lynn and Mira followed. Behind them, the new leaders built a future. Ahead of them, the stars held new battles to fight. But for now, for just a moment, the war was done.